The rain in Oregon didn't just fall. It seemed to seep into the bones of the earth, turning the dirt roads of the Cascade foothills into treacherous veins of mud. Officer Elena Rodriguez sat in her unmarked cruiser, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. She adjusted the heater vents, but the damp cold of the Pacific Northwest had already settled into the fabric of her uniform. She was 32, a 6-year veteran of the force, and tonight she felt every single day of those years weighing on her shoulders. Her partner Miller was in the sick bay with the flu, leaving Elena solo on a surveillance detail that was supposed to be routine. The target was a dilapidated cabin 3 miles off the main highway, suspected of being a distribution point for a new strain of methamphetamine moving through Portland. The intel was thin, but the captain had insisted on eyes on the ground. Elena checked her watch. It was 11:45 p.m., and the forest around her was pitch black, save for the faint, rhythmic glow of her dashboard lights. She took a sip of lukewarm coffee from her thermos, grimacing at the bitter taste. The isolation out here was palpable. The towering Douglas firs acted like a cage, blocking out the ambient light from the distant city. Her radio crackled with static, the low-band frequency struggling to penetrate the dense timber and storm clouds. She keyed the mic, checking in with dispatch, but received only a garbled, broken response in return. Elena felt a prickle of unease on the back of her neck, an instinct honed by years of patrolling high-crime districts. She wasn't supposed to engage, just watch and report. But movement near the cabin caught her eye through the rain-slicked windshield. Shadows were moving, not one or two, but several, loading crates into a waiting van. This wasn't a small handoff. It was a major shipment, and it was happening right now. She knew she should wait for backup, but with the radio dead zones and the storm, help could be 40 minutes away. If they left now, the evidence would vanish into the state's vast network of logging roads. Elena made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life. She decided to move closer to get a license plate number. She unholstered her service weapon, placing it on the passenger seat, and eased the car into gear, rolling forward with the lights off. The gravel crunched softly under her tires, the sound masked by the relentless drumming of the rain. She crept forward, her heart rate climbing, her eyes scanning the perimeter for lookouts. The cabin looked abandoned, its windows boarded up, but the activity around the van was frantic and precise. These weren't low-level junkies. They moved with military efficiency. Just as she reached a vantage point, her car's front tire sank into a hidden pothole, the chassis groaning loudly as it bottomed out. The noise was sharp and unmistakable in the night air. The movement at the cabin froze instantly. Elena cursed under her breath, her hand flying to the ignition to reverse, but the mud held the car in a vice grip. A spotlight from the cabin blinded her, cutting through the darkness like a physical blow. "Police," she shouted, though she knew they couldn't hear her through the glass and rain. She fumbled for the radio, screaming her coordinates, praying the signal would punch through. "Officer in distress. Sector 4, Logging Road, off Route 26. The windshield shattered before she finished the sentence. A high-caliber round punched through the glass, missing her head by inches and embedding itself in the headrest. Glass shards sprayed over her face and uniform. She threw the door open, tumbling out onto the wet ground just as a hail of automatic gunfire shredded the driver's side of the squad car. Elena crawled through the mud, scrambling toward the cover of the dense tree line. Another bullet struck the ground near her hand, sending mud flying into her eyes. She couldn't see the shooters, but the muzzle flashes were bright, angry sparks in the distance. She was outgunned, alone, and effectively pinned down. She managed to get behind a thick pine tree, gasping for air, her chest heaving. She checked her body. She wasn't hit yet, but the position was untenable. They were advancing. She could hear their boots squelching in the mud, shouting commands to flank her. She drew her weapon, counting the rounds in her magazine. 15, against at least 5 men with automatic rifles. She needed to move deeper into the woods, away from the road, hoping the storm would mask her escape. She turned to run, slipping on the wet moss, and scrambled up a steep embankment. A sharp, burning pain suddenly exploded in her right thigh. She stumbled, crashing face first into the underbrush. She'd been hit. The shock was immediate, a cold numbness spreading down her leg. She gritted her teeth to keep from screaming, dragging herself behind a fallen log. She pressed her hand against her leg. The blood was warm and flowing fast, mixing with the cold rain. She was losing vitality quickly. The voices were getting closer, flashlight beams cutting through the fog like searching fingers. She was being hunted in the dark. Alina realized with terrifying clarity that this wasn't just a bust gone wrong. It was an execution in progress. She had interrupted something major, and they weren't going to leave a witness. She checked her radio one last time. Dead silence. She holstered her gun and began to crawl. It was her only option. She had to put distance between her and the road, deep into the unforgiving Oregon wilderness. The pain was blinding, but the will to survive flickered stubbornly in the cold darkness. The forest floor was an obstacle course of slick roots, decaying leaves, and jagged rocks. Every inch Alina crawled sent waves of nausea-inducing pain radiating from her thigh. She had improvised a tourniquet using her belt, cinching it tight above the wound. But the exertion of dragging her body weight was accelerating her blood loss. The rain had turned into a freezing sleet, dropping the temperature further, threatening hypothermia on top of the trauma. Behind her the shouting had subsided, replaced by a more menacing silence. The men hunting her knew she was wounded. They had found the blood trail. They were moving slowly, methodically, sweeping the woods in a grid pattern. Alina could occasionally see the sweep of their tactical lights painting the trees above her, getting closer with every passing minute. She reached a small ravine, a gully carved by years of runoff. It was steep and filled with thorny brush. She didn't have the strength to climb down carefully. Taking a breath, she slid down the embankment, tearing her uniform and skin on the brambles, landing hard in the freezing water at the bottom. The water was ice cold, shocking her system. She gasped, clamping a hand over her mouth to stifle the sound. She lay there for a moment, half submerged, shivering violently. The cold was actually helping to numb the pain in her leg, but she knew it was a dangerous trade-off. Her fingers were already stiff, making it hard to grip the wet earth as she tried to pull herself up the other side. Alina's mind began to drift to the past, a defense mechanism against the brutal reality of the present. She thought about her rookie year, the pride she felt pinning on the badge. She thought about the sacrifices she made, the missed holidays, the failed marriage, the distance from her family. Was this how it ended, alone in a ditch in the middle of nowhere? She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. "Move, Rodriguez," she whispered to herself. "Just move." She dug her fingernails into the mud and pulled. Inch by inch, she crested the ravine and found herself on an old logging trail, overgrown and forgotten. The trail was flatter, easier to navigate, but it offered less cover. She was exposed. The rain had washed away most of the blood trail she left behind, buying her some time. She looked up at the sky. The clouds were thick, blocking out the moon. Total darkness was her only ally. Suddenly, a twig snapped nearby. Alina froze, pressing herself flat against the ground. A beam of light swung over her head, missing her by a fraction. A man's voice, gruff and close, muttered, "She couldn't have gone far. She's bleeding out." "Check the ravine," another voice replied. Elena held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched as two silhouettes moved toward the edge of the drop she had just climbed out of. If they looked down and saw her slide marks, she was dead. She used the noise of the wind howling through the trees to drag herself another 10 feet, hiding behind a massive stump. She gripped her pistol, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She had never felt this vulnerable, this small. The authority of the uniform meant nothing out here. The men lingered at the ravine for what felt like an hour, though it was likely only minutes. Eventually they turned back. Nothing. "Maybe she circled back to the road," one said. They began to retreat toward the cabin. Elena exhaled, a shuddering release of tension that left her lightheaded. She was safe for the moment, but her condition was critical. She checked the wound again. The tourniquet was holding, but her leg was swollen and useless. She couldn't walk. Her only hope was to find a main road, somewhere a passing trucker might see her. She checked her internal compass. The highway should be west. She oriented herself and began the agonizing crawl again. Her elbows were raw and bleeding, her uniform soaked through with mud and freezing water. The physical exhaustion was compounding with the mental toll. Hallucinations danced at the edge of her vision, shadows turning into people, the sound of rain sounding like voices. She bit her lip until she tasted copper, using the sharp pain to anchor herself in reality. Every movement was a negotiation with her body. Pull, drag, rest. Pull, drag, rest. The rhythm became a mantra. She was no longer an officer of the law. She was an animal trying to survive the elements and the predators. As she crested a small rise, she saw something in the distance. A faint, rhythmic flashing. It was a caution light on a distant barricade, or perhaps a tower. It was miles away, but it was a sign of civilization. It gave her a target. She dragged herself onto a wider dirt road, the gravel biting into her skin. She collapsed, her energy spent. She lay on her back, letting the rain wash the mud from her face. She was fading, her vision tunneled. She needed a miracle. Time lost its meaning. Elena didn't know if she had been crawling for 20 minutes or 2 hours. The cold had seeped into her core, her shivering now violent and uncontrollable. Her body was shutting down, preserving heat for the vital organs, sacrificing the extremities. Her hands and feet felt like blocks of wood, clumsy and unresponsive. The pain in her leg had transformed from a sharp agony into a dull, throbbing heaviness, which was almost worse. It felt like dead weight, an anchor dragging her down into the earth. She tried to key her radio again, her stiff thumb fumbling with the button. Silence. The battery light blinked red, then died completely. She threw the useless brick into the bushes in a fit of weak rage. The isolation was absolute. In the city, even in the dead of night, there was always noise, sirens, traffic, the hum of electricity. Here, the silence of the forest between the gusts of wind was oppressive. It amplified her loneliness. She thought of her empty apartment, her cat that needed feeding. Small, stupid things that suddenly seemed incredibly important. She remembered the faces of the people she'd arrested over the years, the anger in their eyes, the desperation. She had always been the one in control, the one with the power. Now, stripping away the badge and the gun, she realized how fragile that power really was. She was just flesh and blood, easily broken. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She closed her eyes, just for a second, she told herself, just to rest. The darkness behind her eyelids was warm and inviting. It whispered to her that it was okay to stop, that the struggle was over. No. She gasped the word aloud, forcing her eyes open. Giving in was dying. She dug her elbows into the mud, pulling herself forward another foot. She had to reach the main road. She had to survive. The terrain grew rougher. The dirt road was rutted with deep tracks from heavy machinery. Each rut was a canyon she had to navigate. She rolled into one, the muddy water splashing over her face, choking her. She coughed, spitting out grit, tears mixing with the rain. She began to bargain with God, a practice she hadn't engaged in since she was a child. Let me get out of this, and I'll fix things with my mum. I'll be better. I'll quit the force. Just let me live. The desperation was raw and pathetic, but it fueled her. Suddenly, a sound cut through the wind, a low rumble. At first she thought it was thunder, rolling through the valley. But it was too consistent, too rhythmic. It grew louder, a guttural growl that vibrated in the ground beneath her cheek. Engines. Not the high-pitched whine of the drug runners. Van. But the deep, thunderous roar of Vitwin engines. Motorcycles. Multiple bikes. Hope surged through her, hot and fast, but it was quickly followed by dread. Who would be riding motorcycles in this weather, on this back road, at this hour? It wasn't a Sunday ride. It was likely trouble. The sound grew deafening. Lights cut through the fog, sweeping across the trees. Elena tried to push herself up, to wave, to signal, but her arms gave out. She collapsed back onto the gravel, helpless. She watched as 3 headlights pierced the mist, growing larger. They were moving slowly, navigating the treacherous mud. The lead bike was huge, a dark monstrosity of chrome and black steel. Elena knew that silhouette, the high handlebars, the loud pipes. Outlaw bikers. In her line of work, they were the enemy. She had spent years tracking them, arresting them, testifying against them. If they found her, a cop, helpless on the road, what would they do? She tried to reach for her gun, but her hand was too numb to undo the retention strap. She was at their mercy. The bikes slowed as their lights washed over her prone form. The engines idled down but didn't stop, a menacing purr. She squinted into the glare, unable to see the riders, only their outlines against the backlight. She lay there, exposed and broken, waiting for the judgment. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had crawled away from drug dealers only to land at the feet of a motorcycle gang. It was a cruel joke. The lead biker killed his engine. The silence that followed was sudden and ringing. The other 2 riders followed suit. Boots hit the gravel, heavy and deliberate. Elena could hear the creak of leather and the jingle of chains. She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry, her voice a rasp. A tall figure stepped out of the glare of the headlights. He was a mountain of a man, wearing a soaking wet leather vest over a thick hoodie. Even in the dark, the patches were unmistakable. The Death's Head. Hell's Angels. Elena's heart sank. This was the worst-case scenario. The man approached her cautiously, a flashlight in his hand. He shone it on her face, then moved the beam down to her uniform, lingering on the badge and the blood-soaked leg. "Well, hell," he grumbled, his voice like gravel grinding together. "Look what the cat dragged in." He knelt beside her. Elena flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, he pulled back her eyelid with a rough, calloused thumb, checking her pupil response. "She's in shock," he announced to the others. "Losing a lot of blood." The man wiped the rain from his face and leaned closer. As the light hit his features, Elena felt a jolt of recognition that cut through her haze. The gray beard, the scar running through his left eyebrow, the cold blue eyes. It was Iron Mike. She had arrested him 3 years ago for aggravated assault in a bar brawl. She had been the one to cuff him while he spat insults at her. "Mike?" she whispered, the name barely audible. The biker paused, tilting his head. He looked closer at her face. "Officer Rodriguez," he said, a strange mix of amusement and surprise in his tone. "I'll be damned. The one who thinks she's tough enough to take on the whole world." The other two bikers stepped forward. One was younger, with a bandana over his face. The other was older, balding, with a skeptical look. "Leave her, Mike," the younger one said. "She's a cop. She's the enemy. Let nature take its course." Mike looked at his brothers, then back at Elena. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the defiance. He saw the tourniquet she had applied herself. He looked at the road leading back to where she came from. "You run into those cartel boys at the old mill?" he asked. Elena nodded weakly. "Ambush," she managed to say. "Radio dead." Mike stood up, towering over her. The moral dilemma hung heavy in the air. The code of the street said fuck the police, but the code of the angels also spoke of honor and territory. These cartel outsiders were operating in their backyard, shooting people on their roads, and despite the badge, he respected grit. Crawling miles with a shattered leg, that was grit. "We don't leave a woman to die in the dirt," Mike said, his voice hard, ending the debate before it began. "Not on my watch. Not in my state." "Mike, are you crazy?" the older biker protested. "If she dies on the back of your bike, that's a murder rap. If she lives, she arrests us next week." "She ain't arresting anyone tonight," Mike growled. He took off his leather cut, the vest with the sacred patch, and then peeled off his thick flannel jacket. He wrapped the jacket around Elena, lifting her head gently. "Listen to me, Rodriguez," Mike said, his face inches from hers. "You're in a bad way. The ambulance won't get here in time, and the cops can't find you. You got one ride out of here and it's with us. You're gonna shoot me, or you're gonna hold on." Elena looked at him. The man she had once called a criminal was now her only lifeline. The lines between black and white, law and outlaw, blurred into the gray of the rain. She reached out a trembling hand and gripped his forearm. "Get me out," she whispered. Mike nodded. He scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing. The pain was excruciating, and she let out a cry, but he held her tight against his chest. "Easy now. I got you." He carried her to his bike, a massive Harley Road King. He placed her on the passenger seat, pulling her arms around his waist. "Wrap your hands together, grip tight. If you let go, you'll fall off, and I ain't stopping." One of the other bikers took a bungee cord from his saddlebag and secured Elena's waist to Mike's, ensuring she wouldn't slip if she passed out. It was crude, but effective. Mike fired up his engine. The vibration rumbled through Elena's body, warming her slightly. "Let's ride," he signaled to the others. As they began to move, Elena rested her helmetless head against the leather of Mike's back. It smelled of gasoline, stale tobacco, and rain, a scent she had always associated with trouble, but now it smelled like salvation. The journey was a blur of wind and noise. The rain stung Elena's face like needles, but the heat radiating from Mike's back kept the hypothermia at bay. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of fire through her leg, but the bungee cord held her fast. She drifted in and out of consciousness, the roar of the engines becoming a lullaby. They weren't taking the main highway. Mike knew the back roads better than any patrol officer. They wove through the dark forest, taking tight turns that defied the slick conditions. The three bikes moved in a tight formation, a phalanx of steel protecting their unlikely cargo. Elena's mind flashed images. She saw the courtroom where Mike had stood, handcuffed. She remembered his lawyer arguing for leniency. She remembered looking him in the eye and seeing nothing but contempt. Now, that same man was using his body to shield her from the wind. She felt a strange sense of shame. She had judged these men solely by their patches, by their rap sheets. She had never stopped to consider the human beneath the lever. Mike shouted something over his shoulder, checking on her, but the wind tore the words away. She squeezed his waist in response, letting him know she was still there. The pain was becoming distant, a bad sign. She knew she was losing too much blood. She needed a hospital soon. She wondered if Mike was taking her to a hospital or a ditch. Paranoia crept back in. Maybe this was a trick. Maybe they were taking her somewhere to finish what the cartel started. But then she felt Mike's hand reach back, patting her arm, a gesture of reassurance. It was surprisingly gentle. It anchored her. No, he wasn't going to kill her. This was a rescue. They hit a stretch of paved road, and the speed increased. The bikes leaned in unison around the curves. For a moment, despite the pain, Elena felt the freedom that these men lived for. The raw power, the exposure to the elements. It was intoxicating. She realized that in this moment, she was more an outlaw than a cop. She was outside the system, relying on street justice and loyalty, rather than procedure and protocol. The irony was bitter. Her vision started to tunnel again. The lights of the other bikes seemed to streak and blur. She rested her cheek against the damp leather of Mike's vest. She could feel his heartbeat through his back, steady and strong. "Stay with me, Rodriguez," Mike bellowed, sensing her grip loosening. He reached back with one hand, grabbing her wrist, pinning it to his stomach. He rode one-handed, navigating the wet asphalt with terrifying skill. They passed a sign for the city limits. Civilization. Streetlights began to appear, rhythmic flashes of orange sodium glare. They were getting close. Elena tried to formulate a thank you, but her tongue felt thick. She wondered how she would explain this to her captain. "The Hells Angels saved me." It sounded insane. It would ruin her career. It would ruin their reputation. But as the city lights grew brighter, none of that mattered. Only survival mattered. The complicated politics of law and order dissolved into the simple reality of life and death. Mike downshifted, the engine growling as they slowed for an intersection. He didn't stop for the red light, blasting through with his horn blaring. He was on a mission. Elena closed her eyes, surrendering to the ride. She trusted him. Against all logic, she trusted him completely. The emergency room entrance of St. Mary's Hospital was quiet until the roar of 3 Harleys shattered the peace. Security guards stiffened, hands moving to their belts as the bikers rolled right up to the sliding glass doors, ignoring the ambulance-only signs. Mike kicked his kickstand down and killed the engine. He immediately began untying the bungee cord. "Get a gurney, now," he bellowed at a stunned nurse standing by the entrance. His voice was so commanding, so full of raw authority, that she didn't argue. She ran inside. The other 2 angels positioned their bikes to block the lane, standing guard, their arms crossed. They looked menacing, soaked and dirty, but they weren't there to cause trouble. They were creating a perimeter. Mike lifted Elena off the bike. Her legs buckled, but he caught her. He carried her through the sliding doors, the bright fluorescent lights of the hospital blinding after the darkness of the woods. "Gunshot wound, femoral artery compromised," Mike shouted, rattling off the medical information like a combat medic. Doctors and nurses swarmed around them. They took one look at the uniform, the badge, and the biker holding her, and confusion washed over their faces. They laid Elena onto a trauma bed. As they began to cut away her pant leg, she reached out and grabbed Mike's jacket. "Mike," she rasped. The room went quiet. Mike looked down at her, his face unreadable. "You're safe now, officer. They'll patch you up." "Why?" she asked, tears finally spilling over. "Why did you help me?" Mike leaned in close, so only she could hear. "Because out there in the storm, we bleed the same color. And because the cartel doesn't run this town." "We do." He winked, a flash of the rogue surfacing. "Sir, You need to step back, a doctor said firmly, trying to push Mike away. Mike stood up to his full height, glaring at the doctor until the man took a step back. Make sure she lives, Mike said, his voice low and dangerous. I'll come back and have a word with you. Sirens began to wail in the distance. The police were coming. The hospital staff had called it in officer down, biker gang on premises. Mike looked at his brothers. Time to go. He looked back at Alina one last time. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and a pen from the nurse's station, scribbled something quickly, and shoved it into her hand. Don't tell Em who brought you, Mike said. Bad for your image. Bad for mine. He turned and strode out of the his boots thudding on the linoleum. The other angels mounted up as he swung a leg over his road king. By the time the first police cruisers screeched into the ambulance bay, lights flashing and sirens blaring, the only trace of the Hells Angels was the smell of exhaust fumes lingering in the cold night air. 2 days later, Alina woke up in a private room. Her leg was elevated, wrapped in thick bandages. Monitors beeped rhythmically beside her. Sunlight streamed through the window. The storm had finally passed. Her captain was sitting in the chair next to the bed, looking exhausted. He'd been there for hours. When he saw her eyes open, he let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. Rodriguez. Thank God. We thought we lost you. Alina tried to sit up, wincing at the stiffness. The bust. The cartel. We got them, the captain said. We found your car. Shot to hell. We found the blood trail. We tracked it to the cabin. State troopers and SWAT took them down an hour after you were admitted. Massive seizure. You're a hero, Alina. He paused, looking at her with a furrowed brow. But there's a piece of the puzzle missing. We found your car miles away from the hospital. You were in no condition to walk. The I staff said some good Samaritans dropped you off and left before we arrived. No names, no plates. Alina looked out the window. She saw the blue sky, the peaceful city below. She thought of the cold rain, the mud, and the roar of the Vituyans. She thought of the rough hands that had been surprisingly gentle. Yeah, Alina lied smoothly. Some hikers. They had a truck. Didn't get their names. I was out of it. The captain looked skeptical, but didn't press. He reached into his pocket. We found this in your hand when you were admitted. The nurses saved it for you. He handed her a crumpled piece of hospital notepad paper. Alina unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. It read, "Angels watch over their own. Even the ones with badges." Morena smiled, a genuine tired smile. She folded the note and tucked it under her pillow. She reached for her badge on the bedside table, running her thumb over the metal star. It felt different now, heavier, yet somehow lighter. Later that evening, after the captain left, Alina stared at the ceiling. She knew that when she healed, she would go back to the streets. She would still arrest criminals. She would still enforce the law. But things had changed. The world wasn't just cops and robbers anymore. There was a code deeper than the penal code, a code of survival, of respect, of shared humanity in the face of the storm. She remembered Mike's face. She knew that if she ever saw him on the street again, the game would continue. He would be the outlaw. She would be the cop. They might even fight again. But there would be a look, a nod, a silent acknowledgement of that night in the Oregon rain when enemies became saviors. Alina closed her eyes and let the sleep take her, safe in the knowledge that, in their own twisted way, the angels really were watching.